Primary School in Derby. I am an English teacher and have been for 17 years, and I'm really looking forward to this.
So a huge thank you to our panellists today. There is going to be a Q&A function that will take place throughout the chats this morning that you'll be able to find. We won't be immediately responding to those questions, but obviously the panellists will have a chance to tweet out their answers to you this afternoon. So please do ask questions. And right, I'm going to hand over to Sarah. So if I can ask the other panellists to just turn off their videos and mute their microphones. And Sarah, if you're able to share your screen, we'll get started.
Right. Can everybody see my screen? I'm assuming that they can, because I'm assuming that.
Absolutely ready to go, Sarah. Thank you.
Great. So we've already done our introductions. I suppose I should have said in my introduction that I've been an English teacher before joining Ofsted. I was an English teacher and head of English and English SLE. So, you know, I forgot to mention that, and it's so important because I think the reason that we're all here today, I think, is pupils. And I just wanted to, in my aims, just start with that. So these are the aims of what I'm going to do. And they're kind of the themes, if you like, of what I'm going to talk about. In the first section of the talk, I'll focus on how our new framework puts pupils at its heart. In the second section, I'll reflect on the English curriculum that we develop for our pupils, paying particular attention to the key factors that both research and inspection evidence indicate contribute most strongly to an effective education. And then I think towards the end, I think I'll try and talk about this idea of disciplinary knowledge in English, because I think as subject teachers, we're very passionate about our subject. And it's important to recognise how disciplinary knowledge gives the subject its distinctive flavour, and how teachers use this knowledge all the time in every second to make minor decisions about the books they introduce, about the way they express things. So, first of all, a huge thank you to everybody, to all the teachers out there. It's a massive, heartfelt thank you for all your hard work during the COVID crisis. I know you've been doing loads of work, whether it's been developing online lessons, developing paper resources to share with pupils, doing preparations for getting pupils back into school. We, really recognise the online provision for key workers, and also the staggered return of different rear groups that's been going on. So a real thank you. Just reflecting on, COVID crisis, there's been quite a lot of chat in the media about some of the things that we've got from the crisis. People have talked about things slowing down, being able to hear the birds. One of the things I've noticed is a lot more collaboration, sort of between teachers, between schools, people working together, making a huge effort, all combined with this kind of common thing, this common cause, to try and get as many people as possible to reach out to pupils to maintain their learning. So that's one of the things that I've noticed. So just to start to focus on this aspect of the talk, which is about the curriculum and pupils. Our focus on the curriculum over the past few years has put pupils at the very heart. We have not lost sight of this in our new framework, and I just want to explain what I mean by that. I just want to give you a moment to read this interview with HMCI that was published in the Observer in 2018, so just before we started our framework. And I think it shows how pupils are at the centre of our work on the curriculum. And in my blogs, personally, in the presentations I've done, I've really echoed this, especially this idea of all children having the right to audacious, challenging, interesting text, so they have a fulfilling education experience, one of substance and integrity, which is kind of, I suppose, the catchphrase, the strapline, if you like, for our new inspection framework. So I just want to talk you through the idea that we have, that I think many of you share, that the curriculum is a lever for social justice. Teachers are passionate, I think, about introducing pupils to new knowledge, kind of the essential knowledge of their subject. And a strong curriculum will enable pupils to deepen their knowledge progressively over time and apply it in those practices that are part of the discipline of English, sort of critiquing, looking at different readings, thinking about rhetoric, etc. The choices that you as teachers, that we as teachers make really matter. The books we choose for study, the books you yourself read is important. The books you read aloud, the references you make in passing, the extracts you might use to illustrate a point or demonstrate a specific feature really, really matter. And I think we've always been really good as a profession at weighing up all the different choices that we have about when we make decisions. So, for example, the need for a diverse writing, different voices from a range of cultures is very important. But we also know, don't we, that texts don't have to provide a mirror image of people's own lives. And I've talked about that in my blogs. So it's not the case that people, have to see their own lives replicated. So if you think about Great Expectations and the struggles that Pip has with identity, his story parallels other struggles that people in our classrooms may have, whether it's with gender or whether it's sexuality or other identity issues. And I've spoken before about something within the discipline of literature that I think we do hold dear, is that we kind of see through a glass darkly. We get much more than what appears on the surface. And that's really important, that children are able to access that, because that's a powerful knowledge. And that's a phrase coined, as you know, probably by Michael Young. And it doesn't mean you've got power over other people. It means it's specialist knowledge about something that gives you power. It takes you beyond your everyday experiences and gives you access to knowledge of academic disciplines. And I think that's part of, I think that's really linked to cultural capital, because that knowledge enables you to play a really strong role in society, to be able to spot, if you like, fake news, to be able to speak truth to power and all those other things. And to appreciate, human creativity and achievement. And this knowledge is not the preserve of a few. This is what Ofsted believes. All should have access to this knowledge, and teachers provide the support to enable that to happen. So that's kind of a sense in which what we're talking about is the curriculum and social justice. And then finally, this idea of an inclusive curriculum, which I'm going to go into a bit more detail. So inclusion in the EIF has been very strong. It's got a high prominence. And I think the idea was it's not an opposition to an ambitious curriculum, rather the other way around. An inclusive culture in a school enables pupils to engage positively with the ambitious curriculum provided, rather than being excluded from it. So I think one of the things I'd like to discuss with you is how much of this building an inclusive curriculum really kind of links with what we do in English. So there's a big crossover, and it's very pertinent to us as our English teachers. And I think we often feel very passionately about inclusion. So obviously we've got this idea, and I'm sure you're familiar with Willingham's work, and we reference it in our sort of research guide that goes with the handbook, about the fact that you need to have some prior knowledge to understand and comprehend. So if you don't have that prior knowledge, you might be locked out of gaining an understanding from a text that you would otherwise have the capacity to do so. So you need to be given that so you can be included in that response to the text. I think we've always, English has always had a functional aspect to it, about kind of delivery of these functional skills. And I think in the past, we may have seen these skills as being quite general, quite cross-curricular skills. But now I think we're much more aware of the knowledge that you need in order to perform a skill expertly. So when we think about literacy, I think we're much more aware of the grammatical knowledge that you might need to do that. And obviously, being able to read and write is essential for access to learning in other subjects. And finally, vocabulary. And I'm sure you're probably quite familiar with the research on vocabulary. We've referenced it in a lot of our roadshow. I think it's important to keep reminding ourselves of this huge landmark study from 1995. And I know that some people have kind of questioned the study. It is worth remembering that these are the words that were recorded. They can't say how many were known, but even if the gaps narrow, it still shows how extensive it is. And what for me is so important is the role that schooling plays in narrowing this gap, how we can help close the gap by deliberately introducing pupils. And of course, English teachers play a crucial role. Words like benevolent, vanquished, constriction, entrenched, these are kind of what's called the kind of tier 2 words. They're not necessarily unique to English, but the kind of words that we find in kind of, I suppose, certain types of fiction, not all fiction, but certain types of fiction, and maybe through more formal non-fiction as well, academic books as well. So we have this very important role in introducing them. And the other thing we have a role in is in developing a kind of habit of reading for pleasure. So I'm just going to kind of reveal one by one just the evidence on reading for pleasure and how it drives up attainment across the curriculum. And this is something that was published by the DFE in 2012, and it's quite good because it gives a really good overview of all the different research on reading for pleasure. And what you're constantly reminded of is the link between pleasure and other things, such as socio-economic factors, well-being, emotional well-being, all of which I think English teachers really know about. But it's often the English teachers who are promoting that, you know, even if it's across the school, it's often who are talking about the books they read. And that's why I mentioned, you know, at the start about the books that we read as English teachers. So I just want to zoom in, having said the word teachers, on Ofsted's curriculum research and what it says about teachers and subject knowledge, because, you know, I know I really wanted to focus on pupils and teachers in this presentation and the importance of you as teachers and your subject knowledge. So, as you may be aware, prior to the EIF, we did quite a lot of research visits, and we went and we did 2 types of research. We visited schools and trialled things out. We also did a big literature review. In phase 1, we explored the curriculum in the widest sense. Then we collected evidence on schools that were vested in the curriculum, that had identified themselves as being, you know, having done some work on the curriculum. And in phase 3, which is the one I want to talk about, we did this model of, you know, we tried out some of the aspects that you now see in our curriculum framework. So we did some modelling about what factors were most important. And this is what we found. That subject knowledge was of considerable importance when it came to designing appropriate progression through content. That's you and what you do as teachers. And that middle leaders with responsibility for leading subjects, which we call subject leaders in our handbook of curriculum leaders, having the right skill set and subject knowledge to carry out their roles effectively and develop staff. And that's why this event and the fact that on a Saturday morning people are here is so important and quite humbling as well. So just to think about this idea of, I'm just going to go back to teachers and how teachers structure and develop the curriculum, sequence lessons and sequence learning. It's interesting, isn't it, as English teachers, we notice things that all of these bullet points begin with the word teachers, and that's very, very deliberate. And I just want you to spend just a second just reading these. There are grade descriptors for good, but what they show is that subject knowledge is paramount. And this is what the research tells us as well. And I'm particularly mindful of one bit of research that I really like and often use. It's by Beaumont et al. In 2010. And they found that teachers with greater content knowledge, I call that kind of pure subject knowledge, have higher levels of pedagogical content knowledge, so the way that we teach English as opposed to kind of the books themselves, which itself leads to greater attention to cognitive activation, i.e. developing pupils' conceptual knowledge, through example, summarising, questioning strategies, those kind of key strategies that we associate with the discipline. And I think that's a really important bit of research. And it's also backed up by research from Mers and Reynolds. And that's our very own Professor Mers, who you might know is the director of research. He found that teachers who rate their own subject knowledge more highly show a higher levels of effective teaching behaviours and better pupil outcomes. So we know that subject knowledge needs to be nurtured, cherished, honed, etc. Some of you may know Claire. She has a big role in Research Ed, and she's also an English teacher and blogs about English. And I think this is a great blog that I like, because designing a curriculum is really complex, especially in English. And I've added "and teachers" to it, because I think, first of all, some teachers have different roles. People have talked about being assistant heads and English teachers. And of course, there's that aspect of where we're sequencing kind of a set of lessons, a sequence of learning, and we as individual teachers are responsible for that. But it's full of complexities, or nuances, as I like to call them. So I'll give you an example, just throw one out. This classic kind of English thing is, we always talk about having to read whole texts rather than extracts, right? But occasionally, teachers sometimes use really carefully chosen shorter and longer extracts, because they've got a conscious intent to teach pupils maybe about the timeline of the canon and different literary forms. So, for example, you might choose 2 of Gulliver's Travels voyages from the whole of Gulliver to illustrate enlightenment and satire. So 2 things kind of coexist at once: whole text, which kind of at the end, but also some well-chosen extracts. And we're constantly, aren't we, navigating our way through this. And it's the work that we do with teachers, talking to leaders and thinking about this, that enables us to kind of really develop the curriculum so it delivers the kind of progression that we want, knowing the nuances, the special kind of twists of our subject. And it is a great subject, but it is pretty complex. So now I want to come on, and I've kind of, I really wrestled with this, thinking about the disciplinary in English and why it matters, because it is really complex. So just bear with me, I've tried to make it, but I didn't want to not talk about it, because it's something I've been thinking about and thinking about how important it is for a while. So one of the things I think it's really important is this, this layer of knowledge, and it is a layer of knowledge within English, but it's not an easy thing. And I'll talk a bit about why it's not an easy thing. I hope from the previous slides that you've seen that I've talked about the importance of subject knowledge and how key leaders are in kind of ensuring everybody's got that subject knowledge and working with teachers. And that's why I thought it was important to include this, because I think it's an important aspect of the work that we do to develop teachers and the training that we do with teachers. And it is, like I said, it is complex. So let me try to define it. Christine Counsell, as you may know, suggests that subject knowledge falls into 2 categories. And this is why I talk about disciplinary knowledge in this way. So she talks about substantive knowledge, which you might call, in some schools, content knowledge. That's what we teach as established fact, say the conventions of Gothic. It's something that's got warrant and has got a reality, okay? So that's what we might call content knowledge. Disciplinary knowledge, by contrast, is a curricular term for what pupils learn about how the knowledge was established, its degree of certainty, how it's revised by scholars or artists or professional, but it's also that part of the subject where pupils understand each discipline as a tradition of inquiry within its own distinctive pursuit of truth. Now, I know we all get twitchy when we talk about truth as English teachers, because we recognise that literature is socially constructed. But I think for me, what I take from that as an English teacher is about those overarching concepts and practices upon which everything rests. For example, that essential relationship between reader, text and writer, and working out that they're not one. And that's a big sort of almost like a threshold concept. If you get that, then that kind of opens the door to lots of other things. or the idea that and that enables you to have different readings of a text. So Christine Cancel goes on to say that each subject is just that, a product and account of an ongoing truth quest, where through empirical testing in science, argumentation in philosophy and history, and logic in maths, or beauty in the arts. And this beauty bit in the arts is important as well, because there is an aspect of our subject, which is an extra complication, I think, which is that there's an aesthetic dimension, there's an experiential dimension to literature. That moment when we respond to a poem with the hairs on the back of our necks going up. So that's something else, that's an extra bit of our subject that makes talking about the disciplinary particularly complex, but I'm going to try and do it. So let's just think about it in this extract. So we've got a lovely picture of 19th century London there, with those lovely carriages. And I want you to imagine a task where you're doing a successful evaluations of Dickens' description of London, say the start of Bleak House. And you might draw on some component knowledge to do that. So historical knowledge, knowledge of how to write an evaluation. So that's kind of the practices. And then there is some kind of big knowledge about who's describing the scene, what is conveyed, perhaps some themes that you might be looking at, whether they're subverting the conventions. But the disciplinary concept would be the authorial view versus the narrator's view. This idea that there's no such thing as an objective description, that a description at the start of Bleak House is through the eyes of, sort of, has got a kind of angle, a point of view. It's sometimes through the eyes of the narrator, sometimes through the eyes of character. In Bleak House, you have the sense that it's probably through the eyes of someone who is caught up in all that chancery, endless trips to Chancery Court, because the description, as you probably know, contains no finite verbs. So it's constantly never-ending feel to it. So that's what I mean about the key overarching disciplinary concept. And if we know that, it's really important, because that's going to help us with this, the pedagogical approaches that we choose, because it'll help us choose the cogsite bits that are going to work best within the grain of our subject. And I think it's really important that we continue to recognise the difference between the curricular aims and the curricular things we do and the pedagogical approaches that we use to deliver those aims. And when we have this disciplinary knowledge, we're able to make really expert decisions about which approaches work best. And as teachers, I think we really, as English teachers, we really appreciate the importance, placing the text at the centre of all we do, not getting too far from it. So what I mean by that is, just enough subject knowledge, background knowledge of Dickens or Britain Victorian times to enable children to enter that text imaginatively, but not so it becomes the history lesson. And that's what I explained there. How comparison can act like a lens. So sometimes comparison, isn't it great that it makes the invisible visible, comparison? But if you compare it with the wrong poem or you don't choose the right text, it can cloud it and make it more difficult. And then, of course, more recently, the disciplinary has guided us in thinking about our online resources and our online curriculum. So it's really important. I often think the disciplinary is something that we know more often by its absence. So when we go to an English lesson, we see sort of knowledge sprinkled like sugar, facts that don't really help us to kind of get to a deeper understanding. Key concepts missing or not deepened over time. And then this disconnected set of skills. And then I think one of the big things about the disciplinary is that if you don't have the disciplinary, you can't deepen the conversation you have with literature. And this is a really big idea that impacts on sequencing as well, is that literature as a conversation, Robert Eagleton coined the phrase, is his phrase. I think what it means like that is just like a conversation, you return to that at different times. So you might do Blake in year 7 and you might do it in year 13 and you return to the conversation, but the second time you've got something additional to bring to the conversation. And that's why the national curriculum actually talks about text being revisited in Key Stage 3. So I just wanted to talk about this, literature is a living conversation, because I think it's such a great phrase of Robert's, because it's from a book when he tries to ask, he's asking the question, what is literature? And he decides that the right question is why literature matters. And he comes up with this metaphor of a living conversation. But for me, part of having a conversation is you need to bring knowledge to that conversation, maybe knowledge of the structures of conversation, turn taking. And the other way I think in which this metaphor works for me about kind of English or literature being a conversation is this literature often is self-reflexive. Books sometimes are about the process of writing. And often after a conversation, you reflect on that conversation, how the conversation went, what you should have said, what you shouldn't have said, how you perhaps should have said things in a different way. So that's the other way in which literature is like a conversation. But earlier on, I talked, when we first talked about discipline, about this idea, this is also an art form. We have an emotional response to it, or an aesthetic response. And I wanted to close this presentation with this idea, because I think it is quite complex. But I'm thinking about that hair on the back of our neck moment and how certain poems really move you. But for that to happen, you do need some well-chosen knowledge, some knowledge that, you know, that teachers with their disciplinary expertise share, and it's that one bit that's going to bring it all alive and make it make sense. And it's often knowledge about symbolism. And that's why I've used this quote, because sometimes it's that understanding of the symbolic or the iconography that really helps you to engage in something more. So I'm going to show this with this picture by Leonardo da Vinci called Lady with the Ermine. So I have an aesthetic response to this. There's a sense of hope. I can see the ethereal beauty. There's that kind of sideways look, the longing. But there's some bits that I'm going to find out that maybe deepen that. So ermine was a symbol of wealth and pregnancy. So suddenly this is a young woman who may be pregnant, which kind of adds an extra dimension. The second thing is that the necklace is jet, and that links to her secret lover. So there's something about the pregnancy and the romance and the passion there and the secret lover, but also the lover had a nickname, which was White Ermine, which also makes you think about the power relationship between these two people as well. And my aesthetic response, I feel, is deepened. It's not changed, it's added to by the knowledge. But obviously, if it was lots and lots of facts about the life of Leonardo da Vinci, where he's born, I think it was just outside of Florence, it wouldn't be the same. So it's those well-chosen bits of background knowledge. So I'm going to end with a kind of hair on the back of the neck poem, and I'm really interested in yours, and I think Caroline's talked about you contacting me, and we'll talk about that in the end, but I'm really interested in your hair at the moment, But before I read this poem, I do have a profound emotional response to this. I had to be quite careful about choosing poems because I'm quite able to kind of weep when I read some things, as we all are. It's written from the point of view of a young airman up in the clouds in World War I, and he's preparing to die. He muses that he didn't join up with any sense of patriotism or duty or the cheering of crowds. He feels no love for those he guards or hatred for those he fights. It's indifferent, almost anti-heroic. But because of my subject knowledge, playing in the background in my hinterland are three other First World War poems. Dulce et decorum est, Hardy's Drummer Hodge, which I think is before the First World War, but is relevant, and Brooks' poem, If I Should Die, Think Only This of Me. And they're a kind of backdrop that's assisting me in thinking more deeply about how the poem presents this young man, who feels a close affinity with a place in County Galway, but even this attachment is couched in fairly neutral terms. But nevertheless, he's prepared to die and do so fairly willingly. And what actually is more heroic than ordinary people giving up their lives in this way? And so as he contemplates his death, he actually, in the clouds, in that aeroplane, owning the sky as he does, feeling that sense of freedom, he's actually ironically unusually alive, more alive than he might be at any other point in his life. And he feels that freedom. And that experience almost is transcendent. It almost goes beyond the death, but not quite. And that adds to the poignancy. So, I know that I shall meet my fate somewhere among the clouds above. Those that I fight, I do not hate. Those that I guard, I do not love. My country is Kilcarton Cross. My countrymen, Kilcarton's poor. No likely end could bring them loss or leave them happier than before. Nor law, nor duty bade me fight, nor public men, nor cheering crowds. A lonely impulse of delight drove to this tumult in the clouds. I balanced all, brought all to mind. The years to come seemed wasted of breath. A waste of breath, the years behind, in balance with this life, this death. Hair on the back of the moments is what we all want our pupils to have, because they're transformative, and it really motivates us, doesn't it? So I'm really interested to hear what your poems are, which ones make your hair on the back of the neck stand out. And that's where I really want to conclude this discussion and this talk. I hope you found it interesting. I'm sure it will generate some questions. I think the idea is, Caroline, that we're going to do that through Twitter, and I'm going to have a bit of chance to kind of have a look at those. I will have to kind of share them with people in Ofsted, because it's going to be public on Twitter, but I will respond to them. But if you want to just, you know, I'm really interested in what your favourite poems are as well, because that's been a bit of a thing during COVID as well. So if you want to drop me a line saying, read this poem, I'd be absolutely delighted. And just to say thank you very much. I'm going to try and get to the point now where I can stop sharing. So just bear with me while I do this. Can you still hear me?
A huge thank you to you for that wonderful opening to the conference. I have tweeted out to people that Sarah obviously wants to hear your hair on the neck, back of the neck poems, and please just remember to use that hashtag TENC, so Team English National Conference, online. There's been some wonderful discussions already, and I'm delighted to say there's 440 English teachers with us this morning, which is a fantastic number. For what it's worth, my own personal poem that I would choose is Adrian Rich's Waking in the Dark. The opening to that, the thing that arrests me is how we are composed of molecules without our knowledge consent. It always just gets me every time. So that's mine.
Thanks, Caroline.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to hand over now to Mark and Matt, who have possibly got the best title for a session that I've had before. So we've got Mark. Matt, are you there?
Yep.
Wonderful. And Mark, if you're ready to share your screen, we'll get kicked off.
Just one moment. I'm just still seeing Sarah's screen at the moment.
That's okay. You should just overwrite it if you share yours, my love.
Okay.
So do also keep using the Q&A. We've had some great questions already. Like Sarah said, the answers to those won't be instantaneous, but we will make sure that they all get passed on, and they're thoroughly appreciated. Got to love some technical problems.
It's traditional. Just gets everybody in the mood for it, doesn't it?
Such a Luddite. He is such a...
Honestly, we're doing this the wrong way around. I really should be doing it.
Or a child pop up. I'm sure it'll happen at some point.
Okay, we working?
We are working. Right, I'm taking my video off and handing over to you, gentlemen. Go for it.
Thanks.
Okay, good morning, everyone. My name's Mark Roberts and he's Mark Pinkett. And we're going to be talking today about masculinity in Romeo and Juliet. We normally talk about masculinity in our book, Boys Don't Try, which you might know as from that. But we're going to be turning to our roots today as English teachers and talking about something that we feel pretty passionate about. Sarah's just been talking there about literature being this living conversation, and that's what this is going to be. We're going to talk about a few ideas about the main aspects of masculinity within the play. Some of them might be some of the more well-known things, but we're going to try and come at things from different angles as well, and hopefully get you thinking about certain parts of masculinity that you might not have seen or thought about in the play before. We're not going to be able to come up with some kind of neat conclusion for this and tie everything together. We're going to look at 5 kind of key discussion points, really. And through that, we can hopefully get some kind of debate going, and we'd love to hear your questions as we get going further on into the play and discussing it on Twitter. So just 1 minute, I just got one more technical issue. I just need to make sure I can move forward. No, okay, bear with me.
Okay, Matt, sorry, Mark, if you just click on the middle of your PowerPoint slide, it should move it on.
There we go. All right, so we're going to talk about sex, violence, Queen Elizabeth, Romeo, and we're going to do that thing that sometimes annoys people where we're talking about what was Shakespeare trying to do, what was Shakespeare thinking at this moment in time as well. So, Mark, do we really have to teach the sex stuff?
Yeah, if you press the next slide, you've got my answer. Of course, we need to talk about the sex stuff. You know, Romeo and Juliet is a play that's kind of replete with sexual innuendo. And I think that, in fact, if we kind of consider that the play isn't actually a play about romance or young love, but actually it's a play about masculinity, I think many people might say that the smut and the sex kind of sits along the violence in the play that makes it this quite masculine play. And the play begins and it ends with innuendo. It's kind of enveloped in sex. That famous opening scene from which the title of this talk comes is awash with language of sexual bravado and sexual violence. But I think it's interesting that in actual fact, this opening scene is not where the sexual innuendo of the play begins. So if we look at the prologue from the play, we see that fifth line down, from forth the fatal loins of these two foes. Now, anybody that knows anything about original pronunciation, and if you don't, I strongly recommend you in YouTube just put in David Crystal original pronunciation. There's a wonderful little video where he talks about original pronunciation. And in that video, he talks about this line. Now, loins actually in original Shakespeare was pronounced lines, all right, the original line. So that's what the audience would have heard. And lines, of course, referring to the kind of genealogical lines of the Montague and Capulet families. However, the word that Shakespeare wrote down was actually loins. So what we've got there again already is this kind of sexual innuendo and wordplay, and that you know, for the eyes of the reader or the ears of the kind of the more astute, filthy-minded listener, Shakespeare, right in the prologue, you know, by mentioning the loins of these families, is drawing our attention to the kind of the act of the lovers' sexual engendering, and this is what Stanley Wells is referring to when he writes that, you know, right from the beginning of the play, this couple is are talking about sex, or they're being associated with sex. Mark, did you want to? So that's sex right from the start of the play. Did you want to talk about sex at the end of the play? Because I've said that this is a play that is enveloped. You know, it's almost bookended in sex.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And if we take a look at the end, this part where Juliet takes her life, on the surface of it, we just got this sad moment as she you know, uses the dagger. But I think when we look at the etymology of this word sheath, vagina was the Latin word for sheath. So there's something very sexualized that's going on here as well. And when you look at the verb rust, it suggests this kind of perpetual penetration where their kind of erotic life together is going to go on into the afterlife. And Bloom says that when Shakespeare is writing about death, and it brings this real charged eroticism to it as well. So even in these kind of scenes where we anticipate that it's just going to be about the tragic outcome, there's something else going on, and you see that in the way that Romeo talks about death being personified as this kind of paramour who wants to get his hands on Juliet as well. There's something interesting going on in this. When we think about the Protestant tradition that Shakespeare's writing from, Rami Targoff argues that in reality, for Protestants, there's not any possibility of sex going on and being reunited in the afterlife. So for that reason, he says that Romeo and Juliet is this great expression of carpe diem. And so when it comes to the idea of sex, it's not just seize the day, it's kind of seize each other while you can, seize each other's bodies while you can. So there's something else going on there in the background as well.
Okay, and so this kind of begs the question, doesn't it? Why is Shakespeare so keen to kind of connect Romeo and Juliet with sex and fornication? Now, the obvious answer, I guess, is that while this is a play about masculinity, It is also a play about love, and often people in love want to have sex with each other. And I think that to cut sex from this play, or to not teach sex in this play, is to kind of prohibit students' kind of understanding of Romeo and Juliet as kind of multifaceted human beings who are as susceptible to, you know, baser kind of carnal desires as they are exalted and sublime emotions such as love. I do want to talk now about the kind of the binary distinctions that people often wrongly make about romantic love and the act of sex. Some critics, readers and watchers of Shakespeare, they often make the mistake of kind of seeing Romeo and Juliet as distinct from the unpleasant sexualized language of the members of the Montague and Capulet gangs that we see in the opening scene, or distinct, you know, from the kind of the humorous sexual innuendo and baldy of Mercutio and the nurse. Certainly, I think people often see Romeo in that way, as this kind of romantic lover. But I do think actually it's important to realise that Romeo can be just as kind of unpleasant in his sexualised language as other characters in the play. I mean, if we look here, this is a rather disturbing speech from Act 1, Scene 1, in which you'll see that for Romeo, Rosaline's chastity is a shield which must be overcome by force. And it's interesting that given that love is something that Romeo so adores later in the play, that here he's positioning love as weak. If you just click there, Mark. So love is weak in the face of sexual restraint. And it's perhaps this realization that love is not enough that prompts Romeo to employ more active methods that you know, centuries later, us men still place blind faith in. So you know, he tries a bit of sweet talk, staring, and then when that doesn't work, he tries some money. And ultimately, at this point, I think Romeo is no better than Samson and Gregory, and in the way that he talks about women and that kind of sexual violence. And like them, you know, he sees sexual satisfaction or gratification as something that is to be gained by force. And of course, if the idea that sex is what we're talking about here is in any doubt, Shakespeare kind of makes us as the reader or the audience member, makes us complicit in Romeo's kind of lustful obsession by, you know, giving us this image of Rosaline's open lap right at the end there. So just very quickly before I hand over to Mark, I do just want to quickly look at this kind of this famous Queen Mab speech, or infamous Queen Mab speech by Mercutio in Act 1, Scene 4. People often see this speech as kind of a bit unusual, a bit of an oddity, fascinating, frightening, but kind of an obscurity nonetheless. And I think if anyone's seen the Lerman version of Romeo and Juliet, you'll be familiar with such a reading in performance terms. However, the critic Harold Bloom, he argues that rather than this speech just being the mad ramblings of a kind of fevered Mercutio, this speech is exactly in keeping with Mercutio's character throughout the rest of the play, because it's a speech all about sex. And Romeo's response to Mercutio's erotic ramblings is to interrupt him. So what Romeo says to Mercutio is, "Peace, peace, Mercutio, you talk of nothing." And of course, we know that nothing means no thing, and it's a pun about vaginas, and you know, obviously, Much Ado About Nothing is famous for using that pun. So I think Romeo's kind of innuendo here is this kind of assertion of masculine understanding to the world, both inside and outside of the play. Mercutio's just talking nonsense, but Romeo and Mercutio are kind of united in their masculine preoccupation with sex. So here what we're seeing is Romeo using innuendo and sexual innuendo as a means of solidifying that masculine bond. And I think that's really interesting. So should we teach the sex stuff? Yeah. I think it's corny, but Shakespeare teaches us how to exist and, you know, how to be human. And our students do need to realise, I think, that sex is a large part of the human condition. Whether it's sex as a byproduct of romantic love or as a means of subjugation and harassment, normally of women, at the hands.
Okay. All right, next question then for you, Mark. So what does the violence of the play tell us about what's going on in terms of masculinity?
I mean, firstly, I think it's important to realise that Romeo and Juliet isn't just a play about masculinity in the 14th century or even the 17th century. It's a play about masculinity in 2020, I think. Neil McGregor went as far to say, that it's more akin to Clockwork Orange than a love story. In answer to the question, what does the violence in the play teach us about masculinity? It teaches us that in some cultures, violence is synonymous with masculinity. Masculine violence reveals itself in many forms in this play. You just click that, Mark. If we ignore a few periphery characters like Peter, the kind of permeating power of violence in this play is something that all the men succumb to in one way or another, except for one man. And it's interesting, this actually. The one man who manages not to give in to violence is Friar Lawrence, and yet ironically or interestingly, his most famous line, arguably the most important line in the play, shows that even he as a man of religion, he is a man nonetheless, and he recognises the kind of all-consuming power of violence. And despite not succumbing to violence himself, I do think he can be. I think he encourages it in Romeo. When he tells an emotionally broken Romeo, "Your tears are womanish," he's asking Romeo to be a man again. And in this play, being a man means being violent. And being a man does mean being violent in this play. In fact, men see it as an art form, I think. If we look at Mercutio's admiration, albeit slightly mocking, of Tybalt's kind of sword play, so what we've got here is, prick song is music that's been written down or pricked onto paper, but that word prick is used elsewhere in the play by Mercutio as a word for the male appendage. So what you've got in this speech here is, we can see that this speech encapsulates the masculinity of play and the wider world in general, where you've got this like intertwining of sex and violence in this strange mix together, and it's kind of venerated by men as an art form, something to strive for, for yourselves and to admire in others. That's a good quote there. Right, Mark. So enough of me. How does this idea of masculinity, how does it relate to Queen Elizabeth I?
Okay, so if we think about the context of what's going on at the time, we've had 4 decades or so of this apparently glorious reign, where we have this golden age where Elizabeth, against the odds, has become this real figurehead who's managed to embrace these masculine values of being seen to be able to defend the nation. And we get this famous speech, which is probably apocryphal, that she delivers at Tilbury in 1588, just before the success of the defence against the Armada, where she says that despite having this kind of feeble frame of the woman as she sees it, she says that she's able to embody these masculine values and to be able to use a kind of assertive violence to defend. So this is something that enables her to succeed as a woman in this patriarchal world. But there's this other side of how Elizabeth is viewed, where we get this cult that builds up around the fact that she's this chaste and pure queen who is keen to encourage comparisons of herself to Petrarch's Laura. So she's this kind of chaste and pure, unattainable person up on a pedestal. And in a lot of the cultural iconography of the time, we see these artistic references to Elizabeth as the moon, and more specifically as Diana, the Roman goddess of the moon, and this protector of virgins. And this is something you see loads in A Midsummer Night's Dream as well, which bear in mind that Shakespeare is writing at the same time. Quick recommendation, if you've not listened to the In Our Time version of Midsummer Night's Dream, I really recommend it as brilliant context for Romeo and Juliet as well. So we've got this going on. So we would then be surprised that by 1595, at the time that Romeo and Juliet appears, things are not looking as well for Elizabeth. She's frail in health, and we've got this succession crisis going on where she's not naming who's going to be heir to the throne, and it's bringing about this real concern within the nation, particularly among some of the elites like Devereux, Earl of Essex, who's arguing that society needs to become more masculine again, and it needs to start to embrace some of the more traditions of chivalry rather than moving towards this humanistic approach. And they see that Elizabeth has now become this kind of embodiment of this weakness and this frailness and this sickness that they see within the society, rather than having this kind of more dynamic, warlike attitude. So when we normally see these references to the moon in Shakespeare, it seems to be celebrating and this kind of more adoration of Elizabeth. But actually, some critics say that this complementary framework is now this smokescreen for this inherent criticism and this subtle criticism of what society has become under Elizabeth, and that is perhaps playing to the likes of Essex in recognising this. So let's have a look at a couple of examples from the play. So on the surface, when Romeo compares Juliet to the sun, or metaphorically as the sun, it seems to just be this reference to her beauty and the envious others, and talking about subtly trying to take her virginity, killing the envious moon. But the reference to the moon, who's sick and pale in the background, gives you this sense that there's this reference to Elizabeth as being someone who's a bit frail and feeble. And then in Juliet's speech, not long after, we get this bit where she says, "Swear not by the moon, the inconstant moon." So we get this sense of this criticism again of Elizabeth for lacking this stereotypical masculinity of being decisive and dynamic and being able to have this real assertive approach to the way that society needs to go. So there's some really interesting things going on in the background when we think about Elizabeth and masculinity. So Matt, this is a favourite conversation of yours. Why do you think everyone always has a pop at Romeo?
Yeah, I guess really this is an apology in the Latin sense, a kind of a defence of Romeo. I think before I attempt to advocate for Romeo, I do think he's an idiot. Like, only idiots kill people, right? And Romeo is a killer. But there are, I think, facets of his personality that we need to forgive. So I think one of the reasons people slag Romeo off is the fact that he talks about his feelings. I was going through Twitter recently, and I got some comments on the next slide about the kind of things that people say about Romeo. And what I think people mean is, when they say these things, is I think they're criticising him for talking about his feelings. I've never understood this line of thinking or this line of criticism, because when we're talking about masculinity, isn't Romeo just doing all those things that good people want our young boys to be doing, like expressing himself, talking about his feelings? And who cares if the poetry's bad? Like, he's writing poetry about how he feels. So I think that Romeo should be kind of championed, almost, in the sense that he's a man who doesn't suffer like from this kind of emotional mutism that so many other young men, or men generally, suffer from. Another thing, just not so academic here, I'm just going to rant. I think another reason that people hate Romeo is they think he's fickle. So he's often criticised for the way he falls straight out of love with Rosaline the moment he meets Juliet. And again, I've never got this, because isn't it just the case that he thought he loved one person, and then he saw another person who invoked greater feelings in him, causing him to realise that actually what he thought was love before wasn't love? I mean, doesn't everyone think they're in love until they meet someone that they're more in love with? So again, I don't think that whole fickle thing works. On the slide right now is, whilst I'm loath to psychoanalyse or assign diagnoses, medical diagnoses to kind of fictional constructs, I did once write this in a book I wrote. It's this one. And I'll just let you have a look at that if you haven't read it already. Now, I would never write about Romeo this way in an academic essay, and whether I'm right or wrong here in what I said is up for debate. But I do think it's a debate worth having in class. I think the texts that we teach are an opportunity to get students talking. And I think that too many schools see Romeo and Juliet as a girly text, all right? Often with boy-heavy bottom sets, it's ditched in favour of the allegedly more violent or more masculine Macbeth. But actually, I think discussing Romeo's experience of the world and the way in which he deals with it is a great opportunity to engage boys in the play, and in discussions, actually, just more generally about male mental health. And because of this, I think we need to be careful in constantly criticising Romeo. A phrase I always use is, critique him, but don't criticise him. Before I finish, in like this kind of this strange kind of defence of the murder of Romeo, I do want to blame Mercutio for Romeo's killing of Tybalt. As we're well aware, Romeo tries to intervene as Mercutio and Tybalt fight, and as he does so, Mercutio is slain. And Mercutio, as he's dying, immediately lays the blame at the door of his friend Romeo. For me, the most heartbreaking thing here isn't that first thing, but it's that last thing where he says, "Help me into some house, Benvolio." I think this is an astonishing moment of cruelty. You know, Romeo is being rejected in favour of someone else just moments after he's tried to save Mercutio's life. And I think it's kind of this final rejection, the favouring of Benvolio over himself, that propels Romeo to kill Tybalt. You click the slide, Mark. So, you know, here, I think what we've got is enacting bloody revenge on Tybalt is a means of atoning for the death of his friend. But I think, you know, Romeo isn't just a murderous and foolish killer. He's a product of this patriarchal society, which equates maleness with violence and aggression and femaleness with timid passivity, you know. And so I think when Romeo kills Tybalt, he's not just atoning for the death of his friend. He's trying to reconnect with that masculinity which he feels his relationship with Juliet has threatened. But Mark, you have a different theory about Romeo, don't you?
Yeah, and again, I know this is not everyone's cup of tea. This kind of what was Shakespeare trying to say. But I think that when we look at the presentation of Romeo and this poetic language that you talk about and his attitude as a lover, I think there's something to be gained from thinking about Shakespeare's attitude towards language and how that might influence his characterization of Romeo, and in particular in terms of his masculinity. So we know that Romeo's set up as this Petrarchan lover, and he fits all these kind of archetypal definitions where he is very much the jilted, unrequited lover, and it's a very hyperbolized, over the top embracing of these kind of melancholic emotions. And he sees him in some senses really passive and kind of abandoned to the fate of this powerful and chaste mistress in Rosaline. When you think of Rosaline as the rose, it's kind of like beautiful but kind of temporary and all those kind of things. And I think the key thing that you fit into this idea is this pleasurable pain that fits into a lot of the oxymorons that we see Shakespeare give Romeo at the early starts of the play. So this is how he's set up. And in terms of the language that you talked about when you were talking about the poetry earlier, the poetic form that Shakespeare often uses is the blason, or blason if you prefer. Sometimes I've seen this spelt with an S. And this is this poetic form that fits into the convention of the Petrarchan sonnet, where you get the figurative language, which is not just describing the beauty of the lover, it catalogues their physical attributes, often in a way that emphasizes their unattainability by comparing them to jewels and the stars and the planets and so on. So we see the way that he blasons Juliet when he compares her to this jewel. Bear in mind that jewel, Juliet, first syllable of her name, it really signals that as well. So Juliet's the sun, she's the fairest stars in all of heaven and all this kind of stuff. But also in terms of the context, when we're looking at what's going on in poetry at this time, we've got this kind of rejection of this conceit, the blason, that's become very cliched. And you start to find lots of Shakespeare's contemporaries are parried in this kind of conceit in what becomes known as the contrablason, so this kind of rejection and subversion of it. And Shakespeare does this himself in Sonnet 130, where the famous opening line is, "My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun." So in his own poetry, he's not going anywhere near this blason, it's cheesy. Whereas he's very happy to give this language to Romeo. Interestingly, Mercutio is allowed to adopt the contrablason. So when he's mocking Romeo's attraction to Rosaline, he talks about things like a high forehead, which doesn't have this particular exciting element to it, as well as getting into more traditional Mercutio territory by talking about her nether regions. But Juliet, interestingly, and this is where I tie it back to masculinity, she talks about what it means to be a man as well as the parts of a man. And she rejects this love poetry as well, even when she's thinking about the more intimate parts of Romeo. So there's something interesting going on here in the background in terms of the poetic language. And it's tempting to see the fact that by giving these conventions of the Blasphème poetry to Romeo's speech, that Shakespeare is not just gently ridiculing youthful romantic idealism, but he's also ridiculing Romeo's brand of masculinity in some ways as well, and his choices as a lover, which don't tally with Shakespeare's own approach, particularly when it comes to his love poetry. So there's something interesting going on there, I would argue. So if we're going to try and tie all this together, and as I said from the outset, we've not got this kind of massive cohesive argument here. We at times we disagree about some of this, but that's the beauty of Shakespeare. It's what Emma Smith calls this gappiness, this great moral complexity, where when you're thinking about the aspects of the theme of masculinity, there's certain parts where you're left with ambiguity. But what I would say, if we're going to try to come to some form of conclusion, is this essay by Robert Applebaum's really interesting, in that you get this impression that the overriding theme is that the young men in Romeo and Juliet are not really in control of themselves. And this is a feature of the masculinity that they sign up to. They believe that they're controlling their own destinies by being able to adopt these particular masculine tendencies, whereas actually they're being shaped by the attitudes to masculinity at the time, which is still inherent in our society these days, I would argue as well. So that's what I'd like to leave us with, this idea about the moral complexity, that the fact that they're not really as in control of themselves as they might believe. Okay, I'm not sure if we've got any time for questions. If not, Caroline, we can happily take this onto Twitter straight after. You're on mute, Caroline, still.
Brilliant technical issues, and there is a cat, or there was at the window before, so it's going to happen at some time. We will keep all of the questions and we will share those via Twitter later, because we're obviously quite pressed for time this morning. But thank you so much, gentlemen. This fantastic discussion already started using the hashtag TENConline, so please dive on there now and join in. But big thank you to you both this morning. I'm going to pass on to Chris Curtis in just a second, but just from me, with 440 people strong this morning, which I think must make us the biggest online English teachers conference, certainly in the UK. If anybody knows any different, then please do tweet me and let me know. The sessions will obviously go live once we've finished. So Chris, if you're there, if you're ready.
Yep, I'll just share my screen. There we go.
And I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about understanding Shakespeare better through characters. And I'm going to kind of carry on a theme that I started off with my book that I released last year. And if I can get my computer working, I can change the slide. There we go. So in it, I was talking about the idea of helping students to understand Shakespeare and the choices that Shakespeare makes by giving them some clear, specific structural choices that Shakespeare could have chosen, and what were the options. And so this is what I'd started with and started sharing with students, and it helped them to explain and to develop their ideas and talking about Shakespeare. So what I'm going to do is going to take that a little bit further, and I'm going to look at this idea. So when we teach Shakespeare, or when we teach literature, these are the components generally: plot, character, language, structure, themes, and the message. And I'm going to look today at character and look at how we can teach character and how we can help students with actually talking about character. So when we talk about character, we can break it down and say that characters are symbols. We can say whether they're major or minor characters. We can say whether they're in the background or the foreground, so we can look at their positioning. We can look at the characterization and so on. And we can look at all these different things to help students to talk about characters. But still we get a number of problems with students talking about characters in any text, regardless of whether it's Shakespeare or not. So when we look at things, so what are the problems that students have with talking about character? Well, often what happens in the stories and when they're writing about it is it's just reduced to the protagonist and antagonist. And for me, as talking about text, it can be helpful to talk about those, but they are largely reductive concepts. You know, what much else can you say about antagonist and protagonist? You know, it's a protagonist, and it's the antagonist. And so students get hung up on those phrases and those terms when we're talking about it. So they're either just spotting whether they're goody or baddie. And then we have the problem where students see them as existing as in the real world, that they're real people. So Macbeth is a real person, you know, when they're watching the play and when they're watching Romeo and Juliet, they're real people, and they treat them as if they're real people. And then we also have them seen in binary concepts. So they're either good or evil, and they don't understand the shades of complexity behind, you know, we can have good characters and we can have good characters that do bad things, but we can have bad characters that can do good things. I'm reminded of the poem Vultures, the idea that life is complex. And so we also have things like a lack of understanding that characters are quite fluid, and the nature of characterization, the nature of characters are fluid. You know, that they change, they're constantly changing, they're constantly evolving and constantly becoming different things at different points in the stories. And I think that's quite hard for students, and they struggle with those things. But the other thing as well is that students also have a limited life experience. You know, when we're looking at characters that are parents, you know, hopefully, you know, these children haven't been a parent, so they don't understand actually the complexities of that kind of relationship. So these are the kind of problems that we face when we ask students to write about characters. So if we take that further, so I'm going to use the phrase audience identification. So we're familiar with that because we know how the world around us today uses audience identification. We know that, you know, on a given show, you know, people would be chosen to help or, you know, identify people in the audience, and they can relate to them. So they know that that's an important thing, and we know that's an important thing. But I don't necessarily think students know that that's a really important thing when it comes to looking at texts. So for example, it's really interesting to think of this because actually the audience for Shakespeare, they were aware of audience identification because, you know, prior to Shakespeare's theatre and just the early time of the Elizabethan age was morality plays. And with the morality play was audience identification. It was a character. They were largely allegorical, and the audience was a part of the story, and hence why we have character, the everyman. And so the story they were watching was a story about them, and it was teaching them about something morally. And so they were aware that they were partly in that story, and they had a role within that story. It was teaching them, and they could see that person in the audio, in the story, and they could relate to them. And there was a clear relationship between the audience and the character. And they knew that, and they could see that because they knew it was teaching. And with a name like Everyman, okay, it's that kind of thing that we've got there, that audience identification. So if we take that further, so for me and my experience of Shakespeare, it's changed over the years. And actually, you know, if I'm honest about it, when I was younger, I identified with Romeo. When I was really, really young, I identified with Romeo. When I got to about university, I was a bit more like Mercutio. And then as I got older, and at the moment, I'm probably in line with Capulet. And I identify more with Capulet. And, you know, the experience he's having to go through and the difficulty for him. And, you know, and a lot of the time we say that Capulet is a bad character and he's not a nice father. But actually, I kind of identify having two young daughters and, you know, wanting the best for your daughter, but also the idea that your daughter doesn't see what they want in line with your views. And so you can see that. And so, you know, at some stage, I'm probably going to end up being like the prince, I doubt it, or more likely to be the friar, some older, wise figure. Okay, so that audience identification, I think, is really important because, you know, for us, you know, we identify with characters in a story and they resonate, they ring true to us. But what is it about that audience identification, and what does Shakespeare do to help with that audience identification? Because at different stages of my life, I identify with different characters. So as an audience member, I can relate to Romeo, I can relate to Mercutio, I can relate to Capulet because I have been those types of people. But what does Shakespeare do? So Shakespeare does these things. So he shows different characters from different viewpoints. So you might have an optimistic character, or you might have a pessimistic character. or he does it physically. So a character is old physically, or life experiences. And so these are the different things that Shakespeare does to kind of help with the audience identification. So you relate. Now, we're constantly talking about, you know, why Shakespeare is great, and it's about the human condition. Well, I think these are things that make up that human condition. You know, the fact that the life experiences we can relate to. I can relate to Capulet because of his life experiences, and mine might be not the right thing to do at the time, but I can relate to it because I've been in a similar situation. We've also got other things in there, you know, social standing, relationships, power relationships, but also the reactions. You know, would you react in the same way that that character does? You know, it doesn't matter what the story is, but we can all say, well, yeah, I would act that way. That's how I would behave. Or I wouldn't act like that. You know, would we be like Romeo? Would we be doing that? You know, in the case with Macbeth, would we? You know, would we have the same reaction if somebody said to us that we were going to be the king? You know, and there was a possibility. Wouldn't we kind of have that thought in there? Okay, hopefully we wouldn't go to the line of killing people, but we'd probably have that feeling, that reaction. And so Shakespeare does this. Shakespeare does this to put it in the story, and they're structured around these things so that different people and they can connect. And we know that in Shakespeare because the characters, we have young and old, and you know, we have big characters in power, characters not. But actually Shakespeare does a lot more, and this is what he does. You know, he gives characters weaknesses. He gives people flaws so we can identify. That's the element of the everyman. We all have flaws. That's what's human about us. That imperfection makes us beautiful. You know, and that's what Shakespeare is drawing attention to. Now, I'm going to take one strand of those. I'm going to look at comedy. And I think comedy is a really, really important thing. Now, comedy is complex. There's so many different routes to comedy. But I think for us, for audience identification, Shakespeare uses comedy. And to prove that point, if I just go to the next slide, if we look at the characters that we have in the story, and I'm going to take Romeo and Juliet for a couple of things I'm talking about, but I will talk about other stories. If we look at the comic characters in Shakespeare's work, and if we look at the comic characters in Romeo and Juliet, for example, we've got lowbrow comedy and we've got highbrow comedy. We've got the old nurse. She's our lowbrow comedy. She's the one that's making sex jokes, rude innuendos, and all that. And that would appeal to the groundlings and, you know, and to everybody really with that kind of, you know, saucy humor. It's that kind of thing. But then also we've got Mercutio, who is a comic character. But I would say that he actually functions at a different level in terms of his comedy, because he balances between that lowbrow, coarse, rude humor, but also he's got that pun, that more artistic, poetic humor. And I think that's quite an interesting character for identification, because actually what Mercutio does is he grasps two different worlds, the low class and the higher class thing. So actually he can get two different sets of audience. And so comedy there is used quite importantly. And it's interesting with Mercutio, because I would say Mercutio is the story's clown, but he's a clown of both worlds, in two different worlds. He's got two different spheres. And it's interesting that his conversation with the nurse, because you've got two comic characters gravitating towards each other. And if you look at what Shakespeare does, is actually Shakespeare uses comic characters around Romeo and Juliet. And actually, what we'll see in other stories, in Shakespeare's stories, is that those comic characters, we know he had some actors who were very good comedians, but we know that if we have a look at those characters together, if you look at Juliet, and you've got the nurse, and then you've got Romeo, and then you've got Mercutio, and actually what you've got is two innocents, but you've got these comic characters surrounding them. And when you kill off Mercutio in Act 3, what you actually do is you kill the clown, you kill the comedy. And that is a massive shift in terms of the story, in terms of the audience identification, because you kill a part of the audience. Because a lot of us, we love Mercutio, and that's quite a clear structural device that's used to have a big impact, because then you can see what happens to Mercutio, this could happen to Romeo. And so it's interesting what Shakespeare does with audience identification. So if we move it to the next thing. So I'm going to take two characters from Shakespeare's plays. I'm going to talk about Hamlet. I love Hamlet. I probably identify now Polonius now, sadly. Okay, fingers crossed I don't get stabbed behind a curtain. But Hamlet is a really interesting character because Hamlet is a comic character all the way through the story. Yes, he's morose. He's like that sad clown. And if we go to Commedia dell'arte, if we go to the Italian comedies, if we look at that, he is that sad clown. He is the sad clown figure. But we've got those comic elements, but also we've got touched by sadness. And we see that, don't we, with comedians. They've got that heavy mix of comedy and drama. But for me, that's the thing that connects me to him, the humour. I love the humour. That's what makes me enjoy Hamlet, the character, the story, and get on, because we're having the laugh. Because what does comedy do? Comedy unites us. Comedy brings us together. Everybody loves having a joke. Everybody likes having a laugh and a silly in-joke. And that's what Hamlet's doing. Hamlet is having that in-joke. Now, Beatrice, another character. I love Beatrice. And it's interesting that what Shakespeare does with Beatrice is Shakespeare makes Beatrice the comedian. And from the start of the play, she is the comedy. She derives the comedy. She's not the victim of the comedy. She stands up and she matches with Benedict's comedy. And I'd say that actually, if we look at how Much Ado About Nothing is structured, it is around Beatrice and looking at her comedy, but also her sad story, and how that comedy can switch off. But that's how we identify with her, and that's how we connect. And that's why I love her. I think she's a fantastic character, Beatrice, but it's the humor touched with the sadness and that sad comic clown. So moving on then. So about the audience identification. So comedy is just one bit, but I think we need to work harder with working with students on helping them to see that audience identification. So I've taken two scenes from a Globe version of Romeo and Juliet. Absolutely love this version, okay? And this version here, and I want us to just think about, what do we identify with? What in these two moments that we could identify with in the story? So if we take that and start thinking about making that explicit with students, because what do you recognize in those two different situations? Do you recognize some part of your life? So do you remember being like that in Romeo and Juliet? Do you remember falling in love with somebody and seeing them for the first time, that first kiss? Do you remember, what was it like? Okay, and on the other side, do you recognize it? Are your parents, do you tell you off? Is your mum standing on the side? That's the nurse here. Do you recognize that kind of situation? Do you understand it? Do you understand what's going on in their minds? Do you know what they're thinking? Do you understand what the father is thinking? Do you understand what Juliet's thinking? And do you understand, interestingly, what the nurse is thinking? And then the final thing I'd say is, do you empathize? So can you, your connection with the story, can you empathize? And this is where it's difficult for students, because I think, we are living in a world at the moment where people aren't showing empathy. And there's a real big problem with empathy. And this is why I think, we talk about, recovery curriculum. I think we have to look at empathy. Empathy is one of the biggest things that we need to work on in society, that empathy and understanding how other people feel. So do you empathize? Because they could probably say, I empathize with, Juliet. She's being told, what is it like? But can we empathize with the father? And interestingly, can we empathize with the nurse? Because that's an interesting relationship in here. So that audience identification, there is lots there that we can talk about. Students can say, yeah, I identify with the nurse in this situation, because it's hard when your dad is telling off your brother and sister, and it's really, really awkward because you don't know what to say, and you kind of know that your dad's wrong, but actually, you don't want to say anything. So it puts that kind of context and understanding and connection with that. So we can take that a little bit further. So in Shakespeare, do we recognize situations? Do we recognize specific people? Do we recognize the dilemma? Do we recognize an emotion? And this is about that connection, because this is the thing. we need to connect students to texts. You know, we know texts are brilliant, we know stories are brilliant, but actually we've got to look at that connection, and actually that emotional connection. Do they understand a dilemma? Do they understand an emotion? Do they empathize with an emotion? Do they empathize with a dilemma? So this is a way that we can kind of help students to build that in, that audience identification. So then we can start using some words and helping. Now, of course, this is AO2. This is all AO2 stuff. This is talking about the effect. And no, at the moment, we haven't looked at any of the language. We've just looked at pictures, but then we can start adding these words into it. And then we can start, well, you know, do we support what the father is doing? Do we respect the father for what he's doing, the character? Do we empathize, or do we pity what's going on? Can we connect? Are we, you know, what do we hope in this situation? And so we're actually talking about what the audience reaction is. And I think that's one of the weakest things when students write about texts and when they write about Shakespeare. You know, they often just default, well, you know, the Elizabethan audience would think this, and then we get a generic comment. We need to start thinking about the emotion and what kind of things that we can say, and to help those students to kind of, you know, empathize and understand the story better. So for example, pity, really, really interesting word, but students don't use the word pity. You know, often it's sympathize, which is used incorrectly. Pity is such a really, really strong idea for students to understand. Who do you pity most in the story? Who's got the most pity? Who's got the least pity? And I think it's something that we can kind of build on with students in text. So we've got some more able students, you know, higher prior attainment, and hopefully this is where Key Stage 3 is really, really important, because Key Stage 3 in our curriculum should be showing them a breadth of Shakespeare, so that by the time they get to GCSE, they have been faced with lots of different situations and lots of different scenarios. So for example, here I've taken father relationships because I identify with the dad, because I'm a dad. But you can see here that I've gone for lots of different relationships. And then the key question we can say to students and our more able students is this consistent with Shakespeare's other plays? Is this the same? Is this a trend? Is this a pattern? So when we look at, for example, King Lear, and we look at his relationship with his daughters and his troubled relationship with his daughters, then we look at Shylock in Merchant of Venice and Jessica, and the whole idea that she wants to marry and become a Christian goes against what he wants. And you can see that we see this pattern, this dilemma again and again in Shakespeare's work. We've got Midsummer Night's Dream. Aegeus and his daughter doesn't want to marry the person he wants her to marry. And so you can see that fathers controlling their daughters is a common thing. We have it in Much Ado About Nothing, the shame that the inky black spot of sexual liaison causes the father in Much Ado About Nothing. And then we've got an unruly daughter in Taming of the Shrew. So we see that story, and I can identify with these stories because there's a father in them, and there's a father who's having difficulty with his daughters, his understanding of his daughters doing what he thinks is best. And of course, we've got loads of issues there in terms of the story. Is it right? Is it wrong? Is it, what the father is asking to do? All those sorts of things are there in the story. So I think we need to get students to be doing this, but first they need to have that audience identification. And then they can say things, well, it's common in Shakespeare's work to see fathers struggling to control. It's common, it's a trope in Shakespeare's plays to show fathers losing power. Usually we see fathers in Shakespeare's plays telling off their daughters. It's a common thing, and it's always a shock when we show Much Ado About Nothing when the father slaps. It's horrendous, it's shocking, but the audience, it's that understanding he's gone too far, and that's that connection and that identification with things. So taking it further, so we can go further with this, with the audience identification, because there's another strand. Because, right, okay, let's connect to the text, but also we can then start thinking, is this a universal experience? Is it something that, look, people in Shakespeare's time were experiencing this? I experienced that yesterday with my dad. It's the same thing. You know, the fathers are just the same in Shakespeare's time as they are now. Or is it an Elizabethan thing? And is the issue that we've got? So, for example, Capulet's behaviour towards Juliet is born out, is his fear of having a daughter that's unmarried. You know, that is a genuine concern for Elizabethan fathers, and the embarrassment, the shame surrounding having a daughter that's not married, and, you know, the repercussions of that. But then also we can then think about, well, are we looking at in a contemporary point of view? Are we looking at this from a contemporary aspect, a modern angle? Do we see this differently to the way that, you know, the Elizabethans? And if we look at this in particular, we look at the marriage thing, don't we? The marriage thing is the difference today, you know, that we allow daughters to have a choice in who they marry. And so that's why today, this context, looking at Capulet telling off his daughter and, you know, and him forcing her to marry, we're uncomfortable because we put the individual having a choice in terms of marrying. So you can see how we can build those layers up for us. So other stories, and there are other stories out there, and I think it's really important to look at the audience identification. So Macbeth, okay, there is comedy in there. It's not as much comedy, and of course, you know, the identification with Macbeth is really about Macbeth himself and this weak character. But I think what's interesting, and we go back to the Globe version of the play itself, is it's interesting that Banquo is very much played as a comic character. And I think that's quite interesting because I've never really thought of Banquo as largely a comic character. And we're not saying a comedian, we're saying there are comic elements and he has little jokes and things like that. And I think it's quite interesting that in Act 3, he dies, which is exactly the same with Romeo and Juliet. Kill the clown, kill the comic element, and it gets sadder and sadder. And an interesting thing about, you know, the Porter, you know, there is a clear comic device, and there, you know, you can see how Shakespeare is using comedy in his stories. So just to kind of finish off, I think this audience identification is a key thing, because talking about two things, and I've put some blogs about how I've explored this in other ways, but I think Christmas Carol is really important for audience identification. I will say this to students, I think Scrooge is the most funniest character ever. I think he's hilarious. I can't stop laughing at the opening, and I think that is a pure device by Shakespeare to make us like him. You know, and I think that's the interesting, not Shakespeare, sorry, Dickens. Dickens is trying to make us like the character. And, you know, that's how he's making our key character appealing. Even though he's horrible and mean and horrible, he tells jokes. And so that's how we connect. We connect with Scrooge because of the comedy. But it's interesting, if you have a look at J.B. Priestley's Inspector Calls, I think that works with that audience identification to the complete opposite. And I'd say that this is also part of to do with part of what was going on at the time with political theatre and drama and Brecht and naturalistic theatre, is that in an Inspector Calls, all the characters are repulsive. They are repulsive to start off with. And what Priestley does is he changes that so we start liking. So we go from the opposite in terms of let's try and build connections. We actually get Priestley trying to distance ourselves and alienate ourselves from these characters. And it's actually, you know, the morality of Sheila that turns things around in the story for us, because it's Sheila and it's Sheila's humanity that turns the story around. They're all repulsive. They're all arrogant. They've all got flaws. They've got problems, but there's no audience identification. And I say that is purposely what Priestley is doing. He wants us to dislike these characters because it's the turning point in Sheila. The turning point in Sheila, and also later on Eric, that makes us identify with these characters. When Sheila starts feeling sorry, that's when we identify with her. And there is a switch. And that's quite a subtle thing for students to really grasp their eyes on, because really, you know, we're alienating all the way through the story until we get to that point. And so there's 2 blogs that I've written about it loosely, but not directly linking to today's talk, of course. So what can we do? What can we do to help students write better about character? Well, I think we need to define what connects the audience to events on stage. It's not enough to do tension graphs. It's not enough to just colour in a little chart and things like that. I think we have to state what is the connection, and we have to talk about the connection, and we can't have nebulous words like, oh, it's, you know, creates a creepy atmosphere, it's a, you know, a doom filled atmosphere. I think we have to say, what is the connection? I identify with this character. So Mark and Matt were talking about Romeo and Juliet, and they were talking about the rude jokes. Okay, well, that is one way of audience identification. Rude jokes, humour. It's that lowbrow humour that gets people laughing, funny. We all like a bit of a rude joke every so often. Well, most of us do anyway. So that's what we've got to start thinking about. We've got to explore how comedy is used to build the connection, which in particular, the death of the clown, exploring the use of the everyman concept. You know, who is meant to be the person in the audience? And also we've got to remember that there are life experience gaps. You know, students at 15 haven't had that much experience of life. And so we've got to help them build that empathy with that. And I'm just going to finish off by just saying, if there's anything you want to ask, any questions, anything, or even if you want to go, I disagree, Chris, that was rubbish, feel free to message me on Twitter. I'm more than happy to respond. And there's my blog there as well. Thank you.
Massive thank you, Chris. The Twitter is going crazy, quite honestly, with comments and questions for you. Again, guys, please just keep using that hashtag TENConline. There's some amazing chats going on. So we've got 2 speakers left for you this morning. We've got Chloe, who's going to try the impossible and use a live visualizer for you. We have done a dry run, so hopefully we'll have no technical issues, touch wood. And then we're going to close with an absolutely fantastic Bennie Para. Chloe and I actually work with Bennie, and we are lucky enough to see that everything she talks about, she absolutely lives in terms of her values and her practice in her own classroom. So I'm going to hand over to Chloe, if you're ready to, you're right, turn off your video and your, right, over to Chloe, thank you.
Thanks. Right, good morning. I'm going to hopefully share my screen now and get to my PowerPoint. Technology's always fun, trying to get it to work, and then I can get going. So I'm hoping everybody can see that. So morning everybody, I'm going to talk to you today about reciprocal reader. And just quickly to introduce myself for those I might have missed at the beginning of the conference, I'm Chloe Woodhouse. I'm an assistant head teacher in charge of Key Stage 3 at the Benrose School in Derby, and I'm also an English teacher, and I also lead on reciprocal reader for our whole school. Our school is all through, so we are using reciprocal reader from our primary phase all the way through to secondary and post-16, and it is being implemented across subjects as well, so not just English. I'm leading on using it across all different subjects, and it's going really well at the moment, which is good. So obviously any queries or anything you've got afterwards, please tweet questions. My email address is there, as is my Twitter handle if you want to message me, and I've got a little announcement, cheeky announcement to make at the end as well. Okay, so reciprocal reader. Now, really quickly, what this is all about are headlines that come up like this, and headlines that we know will be coming up when we go back to school after lockdown around the impact that things will have had on students' reading. So the fact that students have a reading age typically of 13, 14, but need a reading age of 16, 17 to be able to access GCSE texts and their actual exam papers themselves, not just for English. For the maths paper, you need a reading age of 16, 17 to be able to understand before you can either then articulate or demonstrate the math knowledge that you may have. And we know obviously recently a great proportion of our students are learning at home, and they and their parents are doing a brilliant job under very difficult circumstances. But we also know that that gap between word and knowledge, and that gap between the reading ages is only going to widen, and there's going to be a big job for us to do as practitioners when we have our students back in front of us. And we also know we're not going to have an infinite amount of time to work with this. So reciprocal reader is a very good strategy that helps you use the time that you do have effectively. So what is it for? It's to develop confidence with dealing with a variety of texts, to help the students get past the words so then they can actually demonstrate their own knowledge and understanding, because often it's the words that's the barrier. And when you actually speak to them then in the classroom and talk to them, they can then go, oh, okay, yeah, so it's this, this, this. But when they're on their own, or when they're in the exam, the words are a complete barrier, and it stops them from actually realizing that they can articulate and they do actually know what they're talking about. And why are we doing this? Well, the idea that the more a student reads around a subject, and this is any subject, the more that they can mimic that subject. And the students need to read in all subjects. Okay, that's important. It's not a job just for the English teacher. This is literacy. It's a job for the whole school. It's a job for every single teacher that has students in front of them. And we know that, and sometimes it can get lost in the mix because you've got to do the X, Y, Z, and you've only got a certain amount of time. But I do think it's really, really important. And we've got a particular big push on that in our school this year with our wonderful Assistant Head of Literacy, Lisa Palmer, who's also on Twitter and worth a follow, is doing some brilliant work there. But simply put, when we think about reciprocal reader, it lends itself to the idea of metacognition and a metacognitive strategy. And it's about making the learning processes that expert learners and we as experts do implicitly, it's about making them explicit for novices, so for the students in front of us. And it's about making what we take for granted, because we, on the most part, are avid readers, strategies that we would just use as our daily bread and butter, making them explicit for the students in front of us who don't have that repertoire of skills, and that's what we need to develop and build for them. So there are 4 stages to using reciprocal reader in the classroom, and these are the 4 stages. It's predict, clarify, question, and summarize. Okay, so there are 4 stages. So to go into them in a little bit more detail, and then what I'm planning to do, if technology works, is actually then demonstrate the 4 stages with a small section of text. So when we think about predict, what are we going to read about in the next section? Okay, so it's about prediction when you start the text. And often we're very good at doing this, and I'll demonstrate with kind of the book cover and things that we'd look at. But also when you look at a section of the text before you go on to the next chapter, it's that constant prediction. And I think sometimes what we do is we predict at the beginning, what does this cover look like? What does the blurb tell you? X, Y, Z. And then we don't do it again, and we don't make any further predictions. And it could just be predictions that, again, linking to Chris's just brilliant talk just there about character. What predictions can we make about characters as they say certain things, as they do certain actions? What is that going to tell us about their future actions and their future thoughts and what they will say into the future? Clarify. Which words and phrases do we need to find the meaning of? Okay, so again, in the exam, we're not going to have a dictionary. We're not going to have the teacher whispering in your ear, telling you what things mean. So how can we work things out for ourselves so that is not a barrier for us to demonstrate our subject knowledge? Question. Can we ask questions to help us learn more about the text and develop our knowledge? Think about that inference. Think about what is being implied within the text. And summarize. And I think this section is probably one of the most important sections. What are the main ideas in this section? So what are we actually discussing? What have we learned? And often, especially when there are time constraints, the summarize section can be the section we often overlook because we think we need to move on and we need to quickly go on to the next bit. But if we don't summarize and consolidate and make sure and really make sure that learning is stuck with our students, all we're doing is making a bigger issue for ourselves and a bigger problem into the future when we then have to go back. So if you think about Ebbinghouse's forgetting curve, we need to constantly be reflecting, summarizing, and going back to certain things. and this is my teacher voice, do not skip any of these stages. This is bold and it's underlined and it's in red. Do not skip them. It's really, really easy sometimes to think, actually, I'm not going to do predict because I don't really have the time for it. I'm just going to jump straight into clarify or question, or I'm not going to summarize because actually we need to do something else, or I need to get X, Y, Z done. Don't do it. Do not skip any of the stages. You need to keep going through the stages to embed those stages in your students. Otherwise, what you will do is you will embed an incomplete process. And if you embed an incomplete process, then it's not going to be effective into the future for our students. Okay. So moving on then to predict. I did send out a quick little tweet yesterday of the text that I would be looking at. So we're going to look at a very short extract from one of my favorite books, The Handmaid's Tale. So if we were introducing this, so this is a text with literally, we're just going to look at this extract and we've done nothing around it so far with the students, we might do some sort of introduction like this. So we might bring up the book cover and get the students to have a look at that, get them to think about the colours that have been used there, get them to think about why that illustration has been used and what it might suggest or imply or tell us about the text. We might then look at the actual title itself. So what is a handmaid, and have that discussion. I think the big thing that we know as practitioners is not to assume, will they know what a handmaid is? Does the word handmaid need breaking down further? Focus maybe actually on the word maid. What is a maid? Who would have maids? So the idea that you're already starting to think about the balance of the rich and the poor. So the rich would have maids. A maid, does it sound a feminine or a masculine word? So you could talk about the idea that it's quite feminine. So what would you expect women to do? And again, you could then start to have that discussion about typical gender roles. What is a tale? Again, that misconception, it is the tale, T-A-L-E, not with the I. So thinking about that, do we know the difference between those words? A tale, this idea of a story. Look at the punctuation. Okay, whose story is it? Who is telling the story? And the fact, if we think that it's a handmaid, and hopefully we've had that discussion, that with regards to a handmaid, we're thinking that they are subservient, we're thinking that they are obviously there to serve, they're somebody that potentially does not have a voice, does not have power, because they're there as a maid, then actually, what is that telling us? That they are the ones who are then telling the story? What does that tell us that may have gone on then within this text? What does it tell us that they've got this power to then tell us as the reader what may be going on? So we can have a discussion, start to make predictions much further into the text, and get students interested. I've done something similar to this when I looked at a text. It was about time text. Ian McEwen, the name dropped out of my head for a minute, and it was wonderful. We looked at the extract, and then afterwards 5 of the students went to the school library and were desperate to get a copy of the text out because they wanted to read the next bit. So the librarian bought 5 copies of it, which was wonderful, and that's what we want. This is the power, I think, sometimes of reciprocal reader as well. So what clues are we given about the type of story? What clues are we given about the handmaid? We can't see her face, we can't see anything that identifies her. What does that tell us? When I did this, very interesting with students, they talked about this dot, the white dot, and actually they talked about how somebody said, that is that a spotlight, miss? So it's like there's a spotlight on the handmaid, that she's always under some sort of scrutiny, that she's always being watched. And I thought that was really clever, because I hadn't actually thought of that myself, and that was really, really powerful, having that discussion with the students before we then even started to look at the text. So they're getting some ideas, and they're starting to feel a bit more confident about tackling an unseen text themselves, because we've had this discussion. So now I'm going to hopefully stop sharing this, and then I am going to share my visualizer, and I'm going to hope that all of this works. So I'm hoping we can see a visualizer, and I'm sure Caroline will quickly message me if that is not the case. So we should all be able to see the little extract of the text. So we've had a discussion about prediction, and prediction can be as long or short as you want. Like that prediction there, I kind of whizzed through it because of timing, but actually that could be quite a chunk of the conversation within the classroom, which I don't think is any bad thing. It's setting the students up ready for success, and that is a big key thing about reciprocal reader. So each stage, again, dependent on the text and dependent on the ability and how used to reciprocal reader your students are, each bit of the text can take each stage can take as long or as short as you want it to be, but I wouldn't rush anything, especially at the beginning, because it's about embedding those processes. So we've predicted. So now we move to the idea of clarifying question. And for me, clarifying question actually link together. So often those two are very much intertwined, and it is quite difficult to try and pick the two apart. So what I ask students to do is, if we have a text like this, and this is the whole text, I ask them to divide it into sections. Okay, I apologize if you can hear my dog. I think I'm having a delivery downstairs and my dog's getting slightly mental. So this would be section 1, and I ask them to label it. This would be section 2. This would be section 3. And that would be section 4. So we have 4 sections, okay? We're actually, just for the process today, just going to look at section 1. And you might find that when you first start using reciprocal reader, a text of this length, and actually this looks quite short from what we'd normally be used to, that might take you a whole lesson, and that is okay. When I first did reciprocal reader many moons ago, I panicked when this took me an hour to do. I was like, oh dear Lord, how am I going to get through a whole text if this is what I'm doing? Now, obviously, you're not going to do it all reciprocal reader for a whole entire novel. You'll pick out key sections, but it's about the depth of conversation. It's about the knowledge that you want to kind of elicit from the students and impart to the students. And it's also just about the quality of the conversation that you're going to have with your students. That's what's important. So you divide it into sections. Now, dependent on your ability of your group, we teach mixed ability quite a lot at Benrose. You might have some different approaches now. So you might ask students just to read the first section, and it's really important that they don't try and read on, because there's this idea that we're linking to prediction. So we're just going to get them to read section 1, and you might ask your class to read it in silence. What I really like doing is getting them to read it in silence and actually watching them read, which sounds a little bit creepy, but it's not meant in a creepy way. I like seeing who follows that with their finger, who mouths the words as they go along, who reads 3 words and then sees a squirrel fall out of a tree and then you've lost them, and who just stares at it, and because they've kept their head down and you know they're staring at it, they're hoping that you think that they're reading, but they're not reading, they're just staring at the paper. And it's really interesting looking at different student approaches. Now, depending on their ability, you might ask students to highlight the words that they do know. So if you had, for example, a low attaining EAL group, it could be quite demoralizing for them to highlight all the words that they do not know, because it could be literally colour by number. So you could ask them to highlight the words they do know, and then your approach is through that way, actually looking at what do you know and how can we work out meaning from that. For another approach would be highlight the words you don't know. And obviously with this sort of text, you normally have, as you can see, you've got the numbers, you've got the glossary at the bottom. What can you work out from the glossary? And then you can have that discussion about the words you don't know and how can you find out the meaning without consulting a dictionary. If you can't work it out from the glossary that you have, how can you work it out within the context of the other words surrounding it? And I think that's a really important skill that reciprocal reader lends itself to, because that's going to be what students need to do in the exam. It's all unseen. We need to be able to prepare students to try and tackle unseen as best as they can. So I'm just going to read the first section to you, because I can't watch you all reading at home, as interesting as that would be. So I'm going to read the first section to you, and I'm going to approach this as if I'm going to highlight the words that I might not know. Okay, so I'm going to look at it, the words that I might not know. So, a chair, a table, a lamp. Above, on the white ceiling, a relief ornament in the shape of a reef, and in the centre of it, a blank space, plastered over, like the place in a face where the eye has been taken out. There must have been a chandelier once. They've removed anything you could tie a rope to. So I've read through that, and thinking as a student, I would think, okay, what words might I not understand? Okay, so I might highlight ornament to begin with. I'd probably highlight reef to begin with. Plastered, I might not really understand what that word means as well. And we'd identify those. And then I'd ask the students to feed back, and I'd be sat, which is a very weird thing to be sat at the front, with my visualizer ready to annotate with their words that they've told me. So they might talk about the word ornament. So I would take them down to the bottom and the glossary, which tells me that it is a plaster decoration in a raised pattern. Now that might not help them. That might actually be even more complex for them. If we actually look later on where we can see chandelier with 2, it says an elaborate ornamental ceiling light. Well, if you can't get past the word elaborate, then the rest of it doesn't matter, because you're stuck at elaborate and you're thinking, well, what does that mean? So in that case, if it was around elaborate, I'd say, well, if I ask you to elaborate in a lesson, if I say, can you elaborate, can you give me more points? What am I asking you to do? And they might say, you're asking me to explain this. What am I asking for you to give me? You're asking me to give you more detail. So then if we think if something's elaborate, it's the idea that it's actually about giving more detail. So it's something that's detailed. It's not simple. It's going to be quite busy. There's going to be a lot about it. So again, I'd get them to annotate on here. So it's a plaster decoration in a raised pattern, okay? So we've got the idea that here, so we'd say, right, let's write that down. It's a decoration, okay? So it's potentially pretty. It is for show, okay? And we just make some brief annotations around that. They might not know what the word wreath means. So what does the word wreath mean? Like, where do you might see a wreath? And it might be at this point you need to show a picture of a wreath and have that conversation. The connotations of having the wreaths on the door at Christmas, the idea of a wreath that can then link to funeral. So if we have, like, we can put both of those ideas down. So an idea of a funeral, and then we've got death that comes through. We've also got the idea of Christmas and the idea of a Christmas wreath, a holly wreath. And then we'll think which idea links into the overall ideas presented within the text. Plastered. So I might make a joke there and think about, you know, typically women, ladies who sometimes we can plaster the makeup on our faces, especially during the stress of lockdown when we're not feeling necessarily our best. What does it mean to plaster something on? Oh, it means to put a lot of it on, okay, plastered over. But we're saying it's been plastered over. So we've got the idea, and again, non-verbal cues are quite interesting here. So if it's been plastered over, the idea that potentially there, we've got that it's hidden or that we're hiding something. So we've broken down maybe some of those key words that we think that students might struggle with and might, you know, take them down the wrong avenue of what a text could be about. So then we bring it back and we start to ask questions about it. And this is where, as a teacher, when you first use reciprocal reader, it is very, very didactic. It's very much led by you as the practitioner, as the expert, because you've got to model the good practice. Students aren't going to get this just once. I've learned this, I've done it once, and I thought they're all experts. The next time it was a disaster because I let them just get on with it. It's about you constantly modelling and embedding that good practice into our students. So we start to ask questions now of the text, and we are just focusing on this first bit. So what's our initial impression? And we might say, well, our initial impression is it seems a bit empty. It seems a bit plain. And I would say they were really key words to potentially link back to later for the summary. So we might have the words empty and we might have the word plain that we're going to link back to at the end, okay? So we've got empty and we've got plain. Let's see, have we got any evidence that links into that? So we've got a chair, a table, a lamp. So we've got kind of a listing going on there. Again, it's not giving us any detail. We've got the idea that it looks quite plain. We've got, there would have been a chandelier. And if we go down and we've talked about elaborate and what does that mean, the idea of it being detailed, that's been removed. So anything that's pretty, anything that's had detail has been removed. So that goes back to our ideas of being quite empty and plain. Why would we want to remove these things? Now I would draw attention to this, like the place in a face where the eye has been taken out, okay? So I would ask them, what do you think that means? Your eye has been taken out. And we might talk about that. Actually, that's quite violent imagery. So this idea that actually it's quite violent imagery, we've got the idea that if your eye has been taken out, what do you use your eye for? Well, your eyes are being used to see. So you've got this idea that your eyes are being used to see, is to give you a view, to give you vision. And if your eyes have been removed or your eye has been removed, then actually you're left quite vulnerable. You're left quite defenseless. What do they not want you to see? And again, it can start to make links across to the fact that it's something that is actually quite hidden, okay? And this last sentence here, they've removed anything you could tie a rope to. Now, obviously, there's a lot of implied meaning there, but that can be completely missed by our students. The fact that actually they might completely miss what is being implied here. So I might say to them, why would you want to tie a rope in a room? What is that about? Like, why would you want to pull something? What are you wanting to do? And hopefully that will then lead to this idea, this discussion, that actually it's about removing anything that you could actually use to commit suicide with. Well, why would you want to commit suicide? So then it starts to imply straight away, and especially with that violent imagery there, this might not be a happy place to be. This might not be somewhere that you would choose to be. So actually, they've removed anything you can tie a rope to. We talk about the implication here. The idea of suicide can then can come into this bit here. And what I also think is interesting within this bit as well is getting the students to think about that contrast. Think about the beginning: a chair, a table, a lamp. The idea that we've said it's quite plain, it's quite basic, but actually, why are we listing these things? Why are we listing the fact there's a chair, there's a table, there's a lamp? And we're listing them maybe to actually show and get the students to think about how empty the room is. If your eye has been removed, then your vision has been removed. And if this is a very empty room, then the idea that this implication here, that actually it might not be a place you want to be in and you might want to remove yourself from it, then becomes more apparent. And a nice thing to then do, so that's the question and clarify stage kind of being discussed there, and there'll be lots and lots of annotation going on. And then I like to, as part of my summary, to do sometimes a couple of things. In this first section then, let's go back to it. What have we learned? Can you put one bullet point, either, you know, around the text? What have you learned in section 1? Or can you summarize it, maybe using keywords? What do you think are the most important 2 to 3 keywords within section 1? Or even, can you actually create your own 2 words? So for example, the 2 words they would have come up with, empty and plain, are they the 2 words that we use to summarize section 1? So section 1 is empty and plain. We might pull out anything you can tie a rope to as a phrase that we think is important. Well, then from that now, from that first section, what do you think section 2 is going to be about? Okay, this bit here, what more do you think we might learn about the room? And having that discussion with students as well, okay, that links them through. So the idea of maybe we find out why this person is in this room. Who are they? What else is in this room? We might find that information out. And again, it's just getting the students to constantly think, and it links to the writer's intentions. Why are they doing this? What are they wanting us to think about? Why take the eye out? Why have that imagery? What is Atwood wanting us to think about at that moment in time? Because she's not just used that flippantly, she's used that for a specific reason. And it's getting them to, students to think about the writer's intentions and looking at that deep meaning that might be lost without that questioning, without that expert modelling being used. So I'm going to hopefully stop sharing there and then go back to, if technology is going to be my friend, my PowerPoint. And then, oh, made my PowerPoint small and everything keeps moving around. Right, okay, so hopefully, just going back, that's kind of taking you through, it's very, very whistle stop quick, predict, clarify, question, and then that idea of summarize of what you do at the end. Now, it's no bad thing for a text like that to take an entire lesson, because it is about the quality and it is about embedding that practice and those strategies with our students, and it does get quicker. So worry not that as the students get used to it and as they know what they need to do, the process does speed up, but you still don't lose the lack of detail, you don't lose the depth and the quality of the conversations that you can have with our students, which is really important. So here's just some examples of how we've used it within different subjects as well. So here we've got an example within maths that they first started. So we've got the question at the beginning, and then we've got the idea of predict, clarify. They've gone for solve instead of question, and then summary around the end. And that's worked really, really well within our maths department of actually using reciprocal reader. Again, this was another example of where this was quite wordy. So the first example is actually what they've moved to now, to try and streamline in the sense of what exactly they want the students to do, but also get them to really focus on the words that are actually being used in the specific maths question for them. And here's some examples from English as well. So one of the things we've moved to as a department, that Gary Ellis, who's now the head of department, has taken on, is actually making sure that we have the text annotated and provided. So within a department of 13, I've asked the department to go away and annotate one text each, bring those texts back. So you do one text, but you receive 12 12 texts back. So this idea of actually spreading the workload and making it effective and developing skill sets of all teachers is really important. So you have the scanned annotated text that you can use and refer to within your own lessons. And we've also tried to think about the etymology and developing that tier 2 vocabulary as well, and identifying 5 key words within a text, the definition and the etymology of those words, so we can have those discussions, which are really interesting for our students and for them to think about. And because our school is wonderfully multicultural, having that discussion about where all the different words come from, what words can mean in their culture and in their countries as well, which is brilliant to have with your students, and just makes education and just teaching them that little bit more enriching for you and for them. So often when I kind of talked about this and led this at school and led this across subjects, we had that it doesn't apply to my subject, I'm not an English teacher. Well, it's about all of us explicitly teaching metacognitive strategies, reciprocal reader being one of them. As I've already said, we're all teachers of literacy. This idea that I was trying to get some subjects to think about, instead of verbally introducing a topic, can your students read about it, get them to actually give them a text, use reciprocal reader to introduce rather than you just go, today we're going to look at. And as I've mentioned before, the more you read around a subject, the more you can mimic that subject. So thinking like a scientist, read like a scientist, thinking like a mathematician, read like a mathematician, that idea of getting them to read around different subjects. Other things that would be interesting for you to read about as well, if you've not read the EEF Metacognition Guidance Report, it is a really interesting report to read and to look at. And there's a 7-step model used within there for explicitly teaching metacognitive strategies. And I actually have in previous talks linked that to reciprocal reader. And it is something that I'm going to discuss next week, and I will move on to that in a minute. So it is a really useful report if you've not read it to have a look at. And also looking at David Perkins, the 4 levels of metacognition, oh my gosh, my words are going all skew-whiffed, and looking at that is really important as well. And again, those 4 levels link perfectly to reciprocal reader, and help you kind of understand why reciprocal reader can be a really, really powerful tool to use in the classroom, not just for your English lessons, but across all. And one of the wonderful things, quickly going back to here, the fact that we've got it being used across different subjects, science are using it really well, is as I walk down the corridor, I can hear different practitioners going, so today we're going to use reciprocal reader, and the students just go, okay, and get the highlighters out, they get their pens out, and they get cracking, because it's becoming embedded practice, and it's not seen as an English strategy, it's seen as a reading strategy, a literacy strategy, which is important across the whole school. And that's the way you're going to embed it, is not just by using it as an English teacher, but by getting all teachers to be able to use it as well. So that was a very, very quick whistle-stop tour through reciprocal reader. If you have any questions, please send them through. There is my email, there is my handle on Twitter for you to contact me. And my little bit of news, I'm going to be brave, and hopefully this wasn't a car crash. I'm actually going to offer free CPD on reciprocal reader next Thursday. So Thursday the 9th of July at 7:30, hopefully that's a decent time for people to have eaten, put children to bed if they need to, and then you can come and join me. And I'm actually going to go through reciprocal reader properly live. So not that I didn't do it properly this time, I did, but slower potentially, and go through it, answer questions. I can also talk to you about how I've led it across my whole school, how I've embedded it across other subjects, and also share some of the excellent success we've had. So for example, I've established an SLT reading group, and we've managed to, well, through the SLT reading group and their brilliant work, we've seen success of student reading ages going up by 3 years just in 1 term. So it shows you that reciprocal reader does really work, and I'm very, very lucky to work with brilliant people who have allowed me to badger them about reciprocal reader, and have allowed me to just come into their classrooms and see it, and offer advice and steal their brilliant ideas as well. So hopefully this has been of use for you, and if you would like to join me next Thursday, I look forward to seeing you there. So I'm going to stop sharing now and hand back to you, Caroline.
Massive thank you, Chloe. It's obviously, I was proud to see an example from my own classroom in there, just saying, but as line manager of maths as well, I do know that that is something that is genuinely embedded across the maths faculty, and it really just lives exactly what you were saying, that, well, it's Jeff Barton, and I think actually an original source, isn't it, that every teacher in English is a teacher of English. So I'm really proud to introduce Bennie, author of Diversity in English, Diversity Across the Curriculum. I'm sure she'll talk about the book that she's got coming up. This is our closing keynote. We have slightly run over time, as perhaps was always going to be the way. So as soon as this final keynote is finished, then we will be sharing all the fantastic sessions with you, which we've been publicising. And they will be up on our website, www.teamenglishNC.com. So Bennie, when you're ready.
I am ready. It is really lovely to have sat and listened to everybody's sessions so far today. And just to pull out some of the threads that have come through all of the sessions. So Sarah talking about an inclusive curriculum, the idea that through our subject knowledge and our disciplinary knowledge, we stitch students in. Mark and Matt really kind of shining a lens on how to examine text through different perspectives, and particularly talking about masculinity and toxic masculinity. Chris talking about audience identification, and Chloe showing, you know, that actually those texts that we use, like The Handmaid's Tale, aren't just maybe Key Stage 5 texts, that those ideas can be brought in to lower into the school. But I want to bring this back to a personal and political point, and I'm not going to sit here and bang any drums, but I do want to remind us of that child in the room, and through the lens of my own story. And there's no PowerPoint, it's just me, so I apologize if there aren't any flashy visuals, but I think I want to tell this story. So let me get started. So when I was a child, I read to escape into different worlds. I devoured them almost as a form of travel. And in this, I was the reader, the time traveler, the passenger, the silent witness to Heidi's adventures on the mountainside, to Anne's arrival at Green Gables, to Jo March's ascent into writerhood. But the joy I felt traveling with them, it wasn't enough to stop that tidal wave of realization and a real sense of sadness much later as I grew up. I stood squarely on the outside of the text. I was marginalia at best. And if by some impossible magic I could have transported myself into the text and lived in it, then I knew that Pemberley wouldn't have received me, that I would be an exotic rarity in Sherlock Holmes, associated with criminality, sensuality, and depravity. And in Jane Eyre, I'd be firmly locked in the attic, the madwoman searching for herself in the dark with a candle. And in poetry, perhaps erased from jeweled snapshots of moments in time. As a brown-skinned girl with a bad perm and some questionable clothing choices in the 90s, I longed to be the heroine in someone's story and to see myself, to identify, to feel included. I grew to understand that the books I read were of someone else's history. I didn't think to ask why. Most children take what's offered to them in a curriculum without question. And it's only as an adult that I have considered what I needed to know as a child to feel like I belonged somewhere. I needed to know that I was present in the world of the books I read. Where was my place? Did I exist? Who was writing books about me? Did I matter? Did my past, my history, my ancestry, my religion, my culture have any bearing or relevance to the world I lived in? Did my people write books? Were they important enough to be studied? Did my people have ideas? Well, what happened to those ideas? And as an adult, I've sifted through the sands of language and literature, trying to locate myself, trying to connect myself to this land I call home. And in the grains, I found words: brother, mother, tooth, king. And I took these words, spinning the dial to watch them fly back over seas and land masses to find their ancestors. And it was a nearly unbroken journey to my origins in India. And there I was, sitting in the English words I used every day. And it took me to do that as an adult. I leafed through the pages of gods and monsters, kings of men, faithful wives, errant children. Did they only live in this part of the world? Did the world of literature fall away over a cultural precipice somewhere after Greece? When my eyes were open to Gilgamesh and Rama, I didn't suddenly have less space in my brain to know Odysseus, Aeneas, and Beowulf. But I saw the epic hero in my history and felt a golden thread of connections spanning continents and cultures. And I was at least 18 before I read a whole novel written by a non-white author. I say at least because I'm not even sure it was in my first year at university. And I think it was perhaps The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy. And it was the first time I'd seen the land of my ancestors in words. And then there was Rushdie, Vikram Seth, and then the writers of Africa, unraveling their identities, unspooling the tales told about them. And they were all there in a unit called post-colonial literature. I tell this to you now as guardians of the world of literature. I'm conscious that when you're never made absent, it's hard to understand the void. You may not have a precocious Asian girl in your classroom. You may think, I don't need to open those doors, for my children see themselves in poems and novels. They already belong. For those children, the power of an extraordinary English curriculum lies in its ability to demystify the other. The act of belonging is predicated partly on the idea of being welcome. It is one thing to know oneself and to feel belonging. It is another to welcome someone new into the fold and make them feel that they belong. If our students' understanding of the world through books is limited to the narratives of male white Western Europe, lines are drawn both personally and politically. We have all seen the effect of othering in our society. We see it in socioeconomic conditions, in institutional prejudice, in the comments below the line of the national press, in the murder of George Floyd. So yes, Black Lives Matter, and now is the time to look at what we include in our teaching, but it mattered 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, before George Floyd, and I argue it would matter in the decades that follow. So I ask you, how do you make space at the table? How do you help a child feast on their life? And I use this phrase deliberately. I love the fact that Sarah asked us to pick out those poems that make the hairs on the back of our necks stand up. One of my favourite poems is Derek Walcott's Love After Love. Some of you may remember it from the old AQA Poetry from Different Cultures anthology. Let me remind you, he writes, "The time will come when with elation you will greet yourself arriving at your own door, in your own mirror, and each will smile at the other's welcome and say, sit here, eat. You will love again the stranger who was yourself. Give wine, give bread, give back your heart to itself, to the stranger who has loved you all your life, whom you ignored for another, who knows you by heart. Take down the letters, love letters from the bookshelf, the photographs, the desperate notes. Peel your own image from the mirror. Sit, feast on your life." So how do we create an English curriculum that allows all children to be seen? I've been an English teacher long enough to know the practicalities of altering a curriculum. I know it takes time and effort, but if you have the time and the inclination, and I'm very much hoping that you do, let's consider these questions. Who is missing in your curriculum? Whose voices are lost? What is unacknowledged in your schemes of work or choice of text? Who is othered? How are you countering the narratives? How are you balancing positive representation against the inevitable narrow lens of established canonical texts? How are you fleshing out ideas and the ideologies? Where do your students hear the other story, the story of the othered? You take one thing from this. It's my request to take another look, go back and put on someone else's glasses, see your lessons, your schemes of work, your entire curriculum through the lens of gender representation, as Matt and Mark did, toxic masculinity, sexuality, race, and disability. You may not find ways of including everyone, but you might find ways of expanding the literary universe, paralleling stories, countering dominant narratives, and it's a start. And I say this with a caveat. It's not enough to place an out of context unit of work celebrating Black or Asian writers. One culturally diverse book is not enough. Sue Sanders, the founder of Schools Out, coined the term usualizing, and I've talked about this term a lot. It means to make usual the experiences and histories of traditionally marginalized peoples, to stitch them into the fabric of society, to make them part of the daily diet of all children from all backgrounds. Your curriculum then becomes an exercise in ways of seeing and being seen. It becomes a tapestry in which all of us exist. Macbeth is not just a meditation on power and ambition, it's a continuation of the universal narrative warning against defying a natural order and indeed God seen in cultures around the world. Blood Brothers is not just a reflection on class, but an extension of the global narrative on doppelgangers, twinning, brother against brother, seen in Yoruba culture in Nigeria, as well as in classical antiquity. So with that in mind, I finish here with the hope that you have seen me, and with the hope that what you choose to do with your English teaching allows children to sit and to feast on their life. Thank you very much for listening.
I'm almost speechless, quite honestly. I'm glad that I've managed to pull myself together, Bennie, because I've actually just had a good little cry. That touches such a nerve for everything that we do at Penrose, so thank you so much. Right, getting the grip, thanks. I'm going to end the live launch this morning. I just, again, kind of thank so much the panellists. That was really, really special. Give me 5 minutes, I'm going to go and hit the website up, and I will be making live all of those wonderful sessions that we've got to share today. Please continue the conversation on Twitter. It is #TENConline, but thank you so much for joining us. Goodbye.